I grew up in a small town just north of Anchorage, Alaska. My family had moved there only a few months after I was born. My father was a very avid outdoorsman. His childhood was very traditional. His father and grandfather took him hunting and fishing whenever they could. They'd spend so much time outdoors, in fact, that going into town felt almost alien to them, or so my father liked to say. He grew up in Washington State, so he was already pretty accustomed to the dense foliage we live by today. Unlike his father or grandfather, who were both blue-collar men, he went to college and had gotten himself a degree in engineering. During a job interview, he was so flustered by his nerves he couldn't seem to answer the questions correctly. He said it was a miracle that he had even gotten the job. My mother likes to frequently remind him of how awkward his interview was, seeing as she was the one that had interviewed him. My mother worked as a hiring manager for a structural engineering company in Washington. After a few years, my parents had gotten married, and a few more years I was well on the way. Their company was branching out to Alaska, and were asking volunteers if they'd be willing to relocate. My father jumped at the opportunity, much to my mother's surprise. They both made the trip, and after getting settled a few months later, I was born. Throughout most of my youth, my father would always seem to find time to take me camping and fishing. Once I had gotten a little bit older, he began taking me hunting as well. I didn't particularly enjoy the act of hunting, but my father was so excited about bonding that I didn't have the heart to tell him. Years flew by, and every summer it'd be me and him, trekking over mountains and through dense brush. For my 16th birthday, he and I spent an entire week out in the woods. Might not be the greatest birthday present to some of you, but that's what my family life consisted of, so it wasn't too bad. Sometime after my 18th birthday, my father had an unfortunate accident at work. He had a piece of sheet metal fall on him and injured his back. He was laid up in a hospital for almost a month, but thankfully wasn't in any danger. Once he was cleared to come home, he spent the majority of his time on the couch. His birthday was coming up soon, and my mother came to me with an interesting idea. She asked me if I'd be willing to go hunt something as a gift for my dad. I thought about it for a bit. While I hadn't gone hunting by myself before, I had gotten my license and knew all the procedures involved. I also have gone hunting almost every year since I was old enough to. I agreed and told my mom I would try to bring something back, but not to get her hopes up. She thanked me, and after a week or so I had acquired everything I needed, packed up my truck, grabbed my rifle, and headed out. I drove about an hour and a half to our usual spot to begin our hunts. I hopped out of my truck, grabbed my pack, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and began walking. Some of you might be surprised to find that the summer months can be pretty warm in Alaska. I've met tourists who were under the impression that Alaska was a winter wonderland all year round. And while that may be the case for the most northern part up near the Arctic Rim, it's not always true further south. It was a clear sunny day overhead, and I pushed my way through the thick brush. It seemed like a million mosquitoes wanted to take me down before I even got started. As I hiked further inward, keeping a close eye on my surroundings, I felt almost as if every animal was aware of my presence. My father was a far better tracker than I was, and while he did teach me some things, I was mostly a few steps behind him, keeping quiet. During my journey, however, I caught a few indications of wildlife nearby, but they had long since fled upon my arrival. Eventually, the bright sun overhead grew dimmer and dimmer as I trudged along. I knew it would be far too dark to hunt soon, so instead I began searching for a spot to set up camp. After hiking for a few more minutes, I came across a relatively flat area. It seemed as good a place as any to set up for the night. I unhooked my tent from my pack and began setting it up. Being a one-person tent, it didn't take very long. While I still had a little bit of daylight left, I scrounged up what twigs and branches I could and built myself a small fire just outside of my tent. Not necessarily for warmth, but more to keep the insects away. Once I had a fire going, I started to relax, sitting just outside of my tent, taking in my surroundings more intently. There is a strange tranquility that is present when you're in the wilderness by yourself. On the other hand, there is also an ever-present danger as well. I tried not to think of the latter as I got ready to go to sleep. About 3 hours after I had fallen asleep, I was awoken by a noise nearby. It was the cracking of twigs and the rustling of grass. I cracked an eye open, trying to remain as still as possible. Through my stupor, it was hard to discern what had caused the noise in the first place. I listened closer as my sluggish mind became sharper. The faint noise grew louder and louder as it approached my tent. The smell of my smoldering campfire permeated the air around me. I wondered if it might have been a bear, curiously wandering about. If that were the case, I didn't want to make any sudden movements either way. I waited for around 10 minutes, listening intently for any more sounds, but I hadn't heard anything. After another few moments of silence, I began settling back into my sleeping bag and I was once again on the cusp of falling asleep. Another broken twig forced my eyes open again. I was just about to get up and poke my head out of the tent when I heard something else. A voice in the darkness. It sounded like a child, a small boy, and it simply said, "Hello?" Even though I already wasn't moving, I felt my body tense up. Another step sounded outside of the tent, and the voice repeated once more, "Hello?" This time I noticed something very off-putting by the greeting. Apart from the fact that there might have been a child in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness in the middle of the night. The thing that was off-putting was that the hellos were perfectly identical, like it had been a recording of some kind. When I heard it, I instinctively grabbed my rifle which was lying next to me and gripped it tightly. After another moment, I could hear faint breathing coming from the other side of my tent. The voice sounded a third time, and when it did, I immediately sat up in my tent trying to make as little noise as possible, and readied my rifle at the direction of the voice. I could feel sweat beginning to drip down and sting my eyes as I tried to remain calm. I tried to think of a response to this voice, and I could only manage to say, "Who's there?" As soon as those words left my lips, 4 large dark claws dug into my tent like hot knives through butter. The violent sound of tearing fabric filled the tent. Through the newly formed holes, I saw what was making the noise. And it definitely wasn't a child. Its skin was a darkened ash, and its eyes were a contrasting stark white. Its head was completely bald but was covered in multiple pockmarks and scratches. A distended jaw hung slack as thick tendrils of slime dripped from it. Upon seeing this thing, my brain only repeated one single word over and over again. A word which I hadn't used in fear since I was a child. Monster. My shaking hand squeezed the trigger and a deafening ring filled my ears. I couldn't hear anything, but I could see whatever it was stumble backwards and collapse onto the ground. As the ringing faded in and out, I could hear this thing coughing and wheezing violently. I scrambled to my feet and instinctively racked the bolt on my rifle. As I forced my way out of what was left of my tent, ready to finish it off, it was gone. I fearfully scanned the area, keeping my eyes peeled. There was no sign of the creature aside from a small pool of blood in the dirt nearby. I stepped back to my tent and gathered up everything as fast as I could before hastily making my way back towards my truck. The thought of me not making out of the woods alive crossed my mind multiple times as I jogged. Luckily, after only an hour of moving through the woods, the faint light of the sun began cresting on the horizon. It was enough to make my journey back a bit more easier. I found my truck and drove out of the woods like a bat out of hell, and made it home soon after. When I got home, I told my mother that I had been unsuccessful in my hunt. She thanked me for trying regardless. My father chimed in from the couch saying that it would have been different if he had been there, and that might have been true. Even though my father had been injured at his job, I take it as a blessing. A blessing that he won't be going hunting again for a very long time. As for me, well, I don't plan on ever going back into the Alaskan wilderness anytime soon. And if any of you out there are planning a trip, I would highly advise against it. There's something evil living in those woods. Something you don't ever want to see for yourself.